Part 1. I make coffee when I need my hands to look busy. That evening I'd filled half the pot before I heard her key in the door, and I hadn't touched a drop of it. I just needed something to do with the last few quiet minutes before I said the thing I'd come home to say. The line was simple. I'd been carrying it since the elevator. Clara came in while I was making coffee. I heard her keys, then her heels on the tile, then the small tired sigh she does when she wants you to ask about her day. "You're home early," she said. "They let me go today." I kept my voice flat and set the spoon down. The whole analyst pool, restructuring, effective immediately. And there it was. For less than a second, before the concern arrived, before the soft eyes, something crossed her face that I can only call relief. Quick, involuntary, gone before she knew it had surfaced. I have spent my whole life reading the half second before people arrange their faces. Hers said one word, "Finally." Then the performance started. "Oh my God, Ethan." She came around the counter. "Come here." She hugged me, arms around my neck, chin on my shoulder, the full-body version that is supposed to mean "I've got you." I counted, because counting is a thing I do. 40 seconds. Around the 30-second mark, her jacket pocket buzzed once against my hip. One short pulse. A message landing. She did not pull back to check it. Instead, she tightened the hug, just slightly, just for a beat. A woman buying herself one more second before the next thing. I filed the tightening away. That was not affection. Affection doesn't glance at the clock. She let go and stepped back to look at me, still assembling the sympathy, eyes wide and warm and pointed at my face. She performed concern for about 40 seconds. I have had elevator rides with more sincerity. "We're going to be okay," she said. Her voice dropped half a register on okay, the way people lower their voice for the words they don't quite believe. "Yeah," I said. That was my entire contribution. A man who just lost his job is supposed to fill the quiet with panic, with numbers, with what do we do now? I picked the spoon back up instead. She noticed that too. I watched her notice it. A small line appeared between her eyebrows, then smoothed over as she decided it was shock. People love deciding things are shock. "How much did they give you?" she asked. "Severance, for the years you put in. Enough to think about it for a while." "Ethan," a small laugh, no humor anywhere near it. "That's not a number." "No," I agreed, "it's not." She wanted the number, not to plan a life with it, to price one, to learn how many months of me were left before the account and her patience ran out together. I let her estimate. She'd estimate low. They always do when they're already halfway out the door. "Do you want to talk about it?" she tried again. "Not much to say. They emailed the list this morning. My name was on it." I poured the coffee, one-handed, unbothered. "It happens." "It happens," she repeated, quiet, like the phrase had a taste she didn't care for. My phone buzzed on the table between us. Once, face up. I glanced at it. Then I turned it face down without reading it and slid it 2 inches away. Her eyes tracked the whole motion, the glance, the flip, the slide. For a woman who had just watched her boyfriend lose his livelihood, she was suddenly very interested in a phone she couldn't even see. She didn't ask who it was. I didn't offer. Some silences are a quiz both people fail on purpose. "Sit with me," she said, and drifted toward the living room, her own phone already loose in her hand. "We should figure this out." "We." She said "we" the way you say a word you're planning to return to the store. I brought my coffee. I did not bring the panic. I had left the panic in the same drawer as the truth, somewhere she was never going to think to open. She settled on the far end of the couch, one whole cushion of distance between us, and turned her phone screen down on her thigh. Twins, the two of us. 2 people hiding 2 screens in the same small room. "So what's the plan?" she said, realistically. "Coffee first, then I read the letter, then I make some calls." "Calls to who?" A fraction too fast. "People I know," I sipped. "I know a few people." Her screen glowed once against her leg, a soft blue wash under her palm. She angled it a degree away from me, thumb resting on the edge without pressing, a woman keeping a door held open with her foot. "You should take some time," she said, eyes on the middle distance, not on me. "Not rush into anything, because these things, they change what a relationship needs, from both people." "They do," I agreed. I let the sentence sit there and go soft at the edges. She wanted me to fight it so that leaving could look like something I'd forced on her. I wasn't going to hand her the exit gift wrapped as my fault. "I just feel like we should be honest," she started. "About where we are, about where this is actually going." "Where is it going?" She didn't answer the question. She reorganized it into a smaller one. "My father knows people, at firms. If you wanted, I could ask him to make a call, or ask," and she stopped. She stopped because asking her father meant owing her father, and owing her father ran through one specific man with old money and a standing offer, and even Clara wasn't ready to say his name in my kitchen while my coffee was still warm. "I'll manage my own calls," I said. "Right, of course." Relief again, smaller this time, that I hadn't taken the rope she dangled and then quietly hoped I wouldn't grab. She reached for her phone, then thought better of it, then reached for the practical instead. "We should probably move the weekend too. Your head won't be in it. I'll tell them it's a work thing." Them. The dinner at her parents' place, the one she'd spent 2 weeks arranging so I could finally meet the whole family at once. "You'd already booked the table," I said. "It's just the table. There'll be other weekends." She smoothed the wrinkle out of her skirt that wasn't there. "And honestly, tonight's maybe not the moment to walk you in and introduce you to everyone. Given, given that I was, as of an hour ago, a man with no title to announce at a table full of people who introduce each other by their titles." She was cancelling the future in installments, one polite logistics decision at a time, and calling each one a kindness. "Whatever's easiest," I said. "It's not about easy, Ethan." She said my name like a soft correction. "It's about being realistic. That's all I've ever tried to be with you. Realistic." "I know," I said. "You've been very realistic." She heard something in that and looked at me for the first time in a few minutes, really looked, checking whether the knife had my fingerprints on it. It didn't. It never does. I keep my hands clean and let people cut themselves on their own honesty. "I might stay at Sarah's tonight, give you space to process. You don't need me hovering while you make your calls." "That's thoughtful," I said, and meant the exact opposite so cleanly that it looped back around to sounding sincere. Her phone glowed a second time. This time she stood on the buzz, smooth, immediate, like the vibration had a string running straight up her spine and something on the other end had pulled it. She gathered her jacket off the back of the chair, reached into the pocket, not for the phone, I noticed, she already had that in her fist, and came out with my apartment key. The brass one, on the little blue tab I'd given her at the 11-month mark. She looked at the key, then she looked at the door, and then, instead of leaving it on the counter the way a woman ending something might, she closed her hand around it and slid it into her jacket pocket. She was keeping it. Not out of sentiment, the way you keep a spare card you might still run someday. She'd already decided, somewhere before tonight, exactly where that key was going to end up. It just wasn't going to be here. "I'll call you tomorrow," she said, "when things are clearer." "Sure. You'll land on your feet." "You always do." She said it to the wall beside my head, the compliment you give a man on your way out so you can tell yourself you were kind. She paused at the door. For 1 second I honestly thought she might look back, might feel the full weight of a 14-month thing ending on the strength of one sentence I'd invented in the car on the way home. She checked her phone instead. Whatever glowed there pulled the corner of her mouth up before she could catch it. "Get some sleep, Ethan." And then she was gone. Heels down the corridor, quick and even, already lighter than when she'd come in. I stayed at the table. The counter where she might have left the key was bare, clean stone under the kitchen light. She'd taken it with her. Of course she had. I did not get up. 14 months. A 40-second hug, a message she wouldn't name, and a spare key pocketed on the way out like small change you don't bother to count, but don't leave behind either. If I had ever needed the result of all of it written out in plain language, she'd been generous enough to hand me the receipt. The coffee was still warm. A small mercy. I drank it slowly and let the apartment go quiet around me, and for the first time all evening, nobody left in the room was performing anything at all. Then, my phone, still face down where I'd parked it, buzzed again. Twice this time. Not her. I turned it over. How'd it read? Peter. No hello. Peter has not opened a phone call with a hello in the 11 years I've known him. Fast, I said. How fast? I looked at the bare counter. She's already gone. Took the key with her on the way out. Call it 2 hours, start to finish, from when I walked in the door. A pause on the line. Peter has a specific kind of pause. It is not silence, it is a full sentence with the words removed. This one said, more or less, "I argued against running this, on the record, and you did it anyway. And here we are, and I am not going to say any of that out loud because you can already hear me saying it." "The schedule doesn't change," he said instead. "I know. I mean it, Ethan. Whatever you just proved to yourself in that kitchen, it does not move the date up, and it does not move it back. The thing runs when it runs. It was always going to run when it runs." "I know, Peter. It wasn't about the schedule." "No, it never is with you." Papers shifted on his end, the flat click of a laptop lid. "All right, here's what actually matters tonight. The broadcast slot is locked. Morning block, the business channel, the anchor we asked for. Signings at 6. They cut to it live a few minutes after. 6 is fine. 6 is fine, he echoed, dry as a receipt. Wear the other suit, not the commuter one you've worn to that decoy office for 3 years. For one morning of your life, look like the number at the bottom of the page. I'll consider it. Consider it hard. You've earned the good suit, and you insist on dressing like a man who lost a job you never had. That was as close as Peter gets to a joke. I let it land. You all right? He asked. It was the only genuinely human question in the whole call, and he asked it the way a man reads out a checkbox he finds mildly beneath him. I'm fine. It read exactly the way you'd expect. There was no surprise anywhere in it. That's the part that's clean. Clean, he repeated. Sure, get some rest. It's an early morning, and you're still the only signature on that document that means anything. Good night, Peter. He hung up without answering, which is Peter for good night. I set the phone down and stood, and the quiet folded back in, and I carried what was left of the coffee to the window. Below, the street ran its ordinary evening errands, cars, headlights, people going home to other people who would or would not still be there in the morning. I'll be honest, because there's no one here to perform for. 14 months is not nothing, and I am not built out of stone. Some small, tired part of me had half hoped she'd surprise me tonight. She hadn't. People rarely surprise you once you give them a clean, low-cost door and step out of the way. Clara had walked through hers in under 2 hours, pocketed my key on the way past, and thanked me for holding the door open. I wasn't angry. That's the part that would have unsettled her most, if she'd stayed to see it. There was nothing to be angry at. There was only information, and now I had it, and it was very quiet in the apartment. For no reason I could name, I thought of a charity gala I'd taken her 2 months back, the one she'd called boring the whole ride home, where she'd spend the night on her phone and shove the folded program into her bag without ever turning it over. Odd, the details that float up when a room finally goes quiet. I let it go. It wasn't tonight's problem. I picked up the document I'd been reading before she came in. It was not a severance letter. There is no severance letter, because there was never a job to lose. Not the one she believed I had, not the desk at the decoy office, not the forgettable blazer she'd watch me leaving every morning. It was a term sheet. Most of the names on it were blacked out, the way these things stay blacked out until the ink dries and the market gets told in the right order. But the company across the top of the page was not redacted, because I'd stopped bothering to hide that one for myself weeks ago. It was the holding company that owned Clara's father's entire empire. And by 6 the next morning, live on television, in the other suit, it was going to belong to me. I set the phone face down on the desk, sat, and went back to reading exactly where I'd left off. There was work to finish before morning, and not one line of it had anything to do with a key she'd taken. She would never see this room. Of everything the evening had settled, that was the one fact that felt completely, permanently closed. Part 2. The door to Edward Collins's apartment was already open when Clara stepped off the elevator. Not unlocked. Open, a hand's width, warm light leaking into the hallway, the way a door only stands when the man behind it has been listening for the elevator to arrive. There you are, Edward said, before she had fully cleared the frame. I heard. Ugly business, these restructurings. No warning, no loyalty. Come in, come in. He was dressed for a quiet evening at home, soft collar, no tie, a cardigan that cost more than most people's suits. Not the clothes of a man surprised by a guest. The clothes of a man who had cleared his calendar and waited. Clara came in. She kept her jacket on. On the low table a bottle stood open, already breathing, 2 glasses poured and pale gold and still settling. She looked at the 2 full glasses. I didn't ask for anything, she said. You didn't have to. He crossed and put one in her hand, fingers brief on hers. I know how your evening went without you telling me a word of it. That's rather the whole point of me, isn't it, Clara? She took the glass. She did not drink from it yet. She set her bag down by the door instead, the strap slipping off her shoulder, and in the open mouth of it, unnoticed, the corner of a folded program stuck up. The kind of paper you keep by accident and never read. Sit, Edward said. You look like you've been standing in a hallway rehearsing how to feel. I'm fine. Of course you are. You're always fine. It's one of the more expensive things about you. He said it fondly, the way he said most cutting things, and lowered himself into the chair across from her. You made the right call. I want you to hear me say it so you stop turning it over. You made the right call. She sat on the edge of the couch, jacket still on. A woman not yet sure which room of her life she was in. You could have called first, she said, not quite an accusation. I'd have brought something. You brought yourself, late, on the worst evening of your year. He tilted his head. That tells me more than a bottle would have. You didn't go to Sarah's. You didn't go home to your father. You came here. People walk toward the thing they've already chosen, Clara. They just like to pretend the walk was a decision. She let that pass, because arguing would have meant examining it. He took it well, she offered instead, to the air more than to him. Ethan. He was calm about it, weirdly calm. It was the only time either of them said his name that night, and she was the one who said it. Edward did not pick it up. He let the name sit on the floor between them like something the cleaner would deal with in the morning. Men like that are calm because they don't understand the size of the thing that just happened to them, he said. Don't mistake it for strength. Strength has a bill attached. He hasn't seen his yet. His phone lit in his hand. He glanced down, a second, no more, read something over the rim of his glass, and set his face back into place before he looked up. Whatever it was, he folded it away smooth and clean, the way a man pockets a card he doesn't want the table to see. Something wrong? She asked. Nothing that concerns tonight, he smiled. Work never sleeps, and neither do the people who owe me things. Drink your champagne, Clara. You've had a long day being realistic. She drank. The bubbles were very cold and very good, and they tasted faintly, like the beginning of something she would not have to pay for herself. We'll get you settled, Edward was saying, already moving to the practical, already 3 steps into next week. No sense in you rattling around that apartment while he sulks. We won't let this derail anything. Not the trip, not the introductions, none of it. None of it, she repeated. None of it. He raised his glass an inch. To not letting small men slow you down. She touched her glass to his. She still had not taken her jacket off. Edward set his own glass down and considered her the way he considered everything, fondly, and with a running tally kept somewhere behind the warmth. Your father called me this afternoon, he said, before any of this. The quarter's tight for him again. Cash flow, the seasonal nonsense, the same song he sings me every year. He waved a hand, dismissing an entire man's sleepless month. I told him what I always tell him. It's handled. He doesn't need to worry, and neither do you. You didn't have to do that, Clara said. The relief crossed her face a full second before the modesty caught up to it. I never have to. That's what makes it a gift instead of a loan, he smiled. A family shouldn't lie awake over numbers, Clara. Not when there's someone in the room who can simply make the numbers go somewhere else. She believed him because it was easy to believe him, and because he had been making numbers go somewhere else for 3 years without once asking her to watch how. That was the arrangement. He solved, she didn't look. What she did not ask, what it would not occur to her to ask for weeks yet, was where exactly all those tidy vanished numbers had been going, whose ledger they landed on when they left her father's, whose desk, in what quiet office, held the other end of the debt Edward kept so warmly, so generously, from her view. She just felt the warmth. She was very good at feeling the warmth and asking nothing about the furnace. Better, Edward said, watching her shoulders come down at last. There she is. Take the jacket off, love. You're home. She didn't, not yet, but she smiled at him like a woman who soon would. Across the city, in a room Clara did not know existed, I was reading. My real office does not look like anything. That is deliberate. Clean desk, good lamp, a wall of files that mean a great deal and announce none of it. No name on the door big enough to matter. The people who need to find this room already know where it is. Somewhere across town there was champagne being poured over the wreckage of a man everyone in that apartment believed was ruined. I could have told you the brand. I could have told you roughly the toast. I have sat in enough of those rooms on the other side of the table to know exactly how the evening was scored. I felt nothing about it that I could put a name to. That is not the same as feeling nothing. It's just quieter, and it keeps better. Peter was at the far end, finishing a call in the flat, unhurried voice he uses for people he is about to disappoint. He hung up without saying goodbye. Peter does not say goodbye to me, and apparently not to counsel in 3 time zones either, and walked the length of the room to my desk. She's over there, he said. I know. Got there fast. I know that too. He set a folder down at my elbow, squared it to the edge of the desk out of habit, and looked at the document already open in front of me. The other thing's schedule doesn't move, he said, in case tonight put ideas in your head about moving it. It didn't, and I know. Peter has been calling the acquisition the other thing for 9 months. I stopped asking him to use the fund's name somewhere around month 3. It's more accurate anyway. Names make a thing sound like it needs your permission. The other thing never has. 6 o'clock, he said. You, the pen, the good suit. They cut to it live after. Anchors briefed, galleries cleared, the release goes out the second signatures dry. You do nothing but sit down and write your name and not answer questions. I can manage not answering questions. You've built a career on it. He picked the folder back up. At the door he stopped, one hand on the frame, and did the thing he does. You went looking for something tonight. I wasn't looking for anything. He didn't argue. He didn't agree. He just paused, that specific Peter pause, the one that is a whole paragraph with the words taken out, long enough for both of us to hear the sentence he wasn't going to say, and then he left. The office went quiet. Behind me, on the wall, there's a framed thing I never look at anymore, a name, a mark, from the year the fund closed its first fund. In the dark half of the room you can't quite read it. Most people never do. That too is the point. On the back of the door hung the good suit, pressed, waiting, still in its bag. Peter had sent it over 3 days ago with a note that said, in full, "Wear this or I do the signing." Peter's idea of a joke and Peter's idea of a threat are the same length and share a font. I looked back down at the term sheet and kept reading. She was over there. I was here. The two facts sat side by side and refused to weigh the same, no matter how long I looked at them. That was fine. Some things aren't supposed to balance. They're just supposed to be true at the same time. By the time the champagne was half gone, Clara had finally taken her jacket off. She hung it over the back of a chair that had clearly never held a jacket before, in a room where everything had a designated and more expensive place. And for a moment, she stood in the middle of Edward's apartment, like a woman trying the word home in her mouth to see if it fit yet. It almost did. It would, she told herself, by the weekend. Edward had drifted into the other room to take a call he called boring and treated like oxygen. She carried her glass into his kitchen, bright, cold, a kitchen that had never once been cooked in, and set it on the counter. Then she took the key out of her jacket pocket. Ethan's key. The brass one, blue tab, the one she'd lifted off his counter on her way out, because leaving it behind felt, in the moment, like a scene. And Clara did not do scenes. She did decisions. She held it for a second, turned it once in the light. Then she set it down on Edward's kitchen counter, not thrown, not dropped, placed, with the small precision of a woman who had already worked out, somewhere weeks ago, exactly which counter it would end up on. "It looks very small on all that marble. You'll want to be up early tomorrow," Edward said from the kitchen doorway, phone still warm in his hand. "The car comes at 8. We'll make a day of it. Get your mind off things." "I know," she said. He went back to the living room. She stood alone in the clean kitchen a moment longer. Then she picked up her own phone, opened it, found Ethan's name in her contacts, the photo she'd taken of him at some gala, squinting, holding a program he'd tried to make her read. She pressed block. A small box asked if she was sure. She looked at the photo one more second, the gala, the squint, the program he'd tried to make her read, and she pressed confirm. The name went grey, then it went nowhere at all. 14 months closed with the soft final sound of a phone deciding a person no longer existed. She felt, if she felt anything, efficient. Then she turned the phone face down on the counter, beside the key, and went to join Edward in the other room, where the lights were warm and the champagne was cold, and nothing that had happened tonight was going to cost her a single thing. That was the arithmetic, as she understood it at 11:47 that night. She'd know the exact minute later, because the phone keeps the time you decide a person is over. She had subtracted a liability and added a benefactor, clean books, a good night's work. She had the numbers exactly backward, and she would not find that out until a television told her, in front of no one, at 6. In my office, at 1 in the morning, I finished the page I was on. I marked my place. I did not need to. I know these pages the way you know a road home. I marked it anyway, out of respect for the work, and reached over and turned off the lamp. The room went dark. On the desk, the term sheet stayed where it was, waiting for morning and the good suit and the pen. Even in the dark, if you leaned in, you could still read the one name on it that had never been blacked out, the company that, in 5 hours, would stop being her father's and start being mine. I left it there. It would keep. Part 3. Clara woke to an apartment that had been awake for hours without her. It was not yet 7. Through the bedroom door she could hear Edward's voice in the kitchen, low, clipped, the register of a man who does not want to be overheard and is too disciplined to whisper. She lay still a moment and listened to the shape of it without catching the words. The warmth of last night was gone from his voice. She told herself it was only the morning. Men are different in the morning. She found him standing at the counter, phone against his ear, his back to her. The good cardigan was gone. He was already dressed, already sharp, already somewhere else. Then you call me the second it moves, not after, not after, he said, and ended the call without a goodbye, and turned and put the phone face down on the marble before she could see the screen. Morning, she said. Good morning. A nod. Not rude, just brief, the way you're brief with someone standing between you and a thought. He turned back to the machine and made coffee with his back to her. 2 cups. He knew she was there. He hadn't asked. He simply made 2. He set one in front of her on the counter. Beside it, still where she'd left it in the night, sat the brass key with its little blue tab. His phone leaned face down on the marble, buzzing in a slow circle. He picked it up, looked, and walked out into the hallway to take it, pulling the door half shut behind him. Clara stood in the kitchen with her coffee and listened to another voice she wasn't allowed to hear. She finished the cup faster than she meant to. Then, without thinking, she reached for the pot and poured a second, and only halfway through realized she'd done it out of habit, the old habit. 2 cups in the morning, one for her and one to set down in front of someone who wasn't here and wasn't coming. She stood looking at the second cup for a moment. Then she carried it to the sink and poured it out, slowly, watching the coffee thread down the drain and disappear. She did not move for a second after it was gone. The pouring had taken longer than it needed to. It was a small thing, the second cup. That was what unsettled her about it. She'd have expected the leaving to feel large, some grand door slamming, some scene worth the 14 months. Instead, the leaving was showing up in the tiniest places, uninvited, like a habit that hadn't heard the news. Her hand had made a second coffee for a man she'd blocked at 11:47 the night before, and her hand had not consulted her about it. She stood at the sink and understood, dimly, that you can decide to leave someone in 4 hours, but you cannot unlearn them that fast. The body keeps pouring the extra cup for a while, out of a muscle memory that doesn't take instructions. She just hadn't expected the body to be the sentimental one. She'd always thought that part of her was hers to command. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Her father. Dad, hi. Clara. His voice was flat in a way she didn't have a name for. Not cold, emptied. Things are moving with the business, fast. I'll explain when I can. What things? Moving how? I'll explain when I can. Just don't do anything today. Stay where you are. A pause. Are you at Edward's? It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it as one. Yeah. Okay. And then, quieter, almost to himself. Okay. He hung up. She looked at the phone. Things are moving. She turned the phrase over once, found no handle on it, and set it down. Her father was always vague when a quarter went bad. This was probably that. It was almost certainly that. Edward came back from the hallway, sliding the phone into his pocket, his face arranged into calm the way a bed gets made, smooth on top, everything shoved under. Everything all right? She asked. You seem... Everything's fine. Too quick, too smooth. Markets. It's a Tuesday. Tuesdays are always like this. It's Wednesday. He looked at her then, really looked. The first time all morning his eyes had actually landed on her, and something moved behind them she couldn't read. Irritation, maybe, or the effort of holding a much larger thing very still. Then it's a Wednesday, he said, and smiled. The smile did not reach the phone in his pocket, which buzzed again, twice, as if to correct him on more than the day. Sorry, work. He picked up his own cup, took a swallow, set it down. What do you feel like for breakfast? I'll have something brought up. I'm not really hungry. You will be. He kissed the top of her head, distracted, already reading something on the phone he'd just put away. Give me an hour, this'll settle. He left his coffee on the table, half full. She watched it sit there and go still, and something small and cold moved through her, because in 3 years she had never once seen Edward Collins leave a cup of coffee unfinished. He finished things. That was the entire brand of him. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like nerves. So she stood in the beautiful kitchen between 2 abandoned cups of coffee, his and the one she'd poured down the drain, and waited for an hour that was supposed to settle things. The apartment was very quiet, too quiet for a morning that had this many phone calls hiding inside it. She wandered to the window with her arms crossed and looked at the city she was supposed to be starting a cleaner life in, and found she couldn't quite locate the feeling she'd had the night before, the efficient one, the clean books one. Somewhere between the block button and this window, it had gone thin. She checked her phone. Out of pure habit, her thumb went to the one contact it always used to go to, first thing, and found the grey, blocked shape where his name used to be. She had put it there herself. She could have unblocked it in 4 seconds. She didn't. There was no reason to. Whatever her father meant by moving, whatever was making Edward lie about the day of the week, it lived in the world of markets and quarters and men who took calls in hallways. It had nothing to do with the quiet man who'd let her go without a fight. She turned back to the room and its 2 cold cups and its silence, and she waited. Across the city, I was putting on a suit, not the blazer. The blazer had done its 3 years of honest work convincing a woman I loved that I rode the elevator down to a desk that mattered to no one. This morning, it stayed on its hook. This morning I wore the other thing, dark, exact, cut by someone who had measured me twice and said nothing about the price. Peter had laid it out 3 weeks ago. I adjusted the cuffs and did the small arithmetic on that. Peter picked this suit out 3 weeks ago. He never mentioned he'd already planned for this morning. He never tells me anything until it's already filed, cleared, and impossible to argue with. He'd rather show me a finished thing than ask my permission for an unfinished one. In 11 years, it has never once been the wrong call. Behind me on the wall there was a plaque. A name, a small mark beside it, the year the first fund closed. I didn't look at it. I've stood in front of it 10,000 times, and I don't need to read my own name to know it's there. If you'd been in the room, you might have caught it for a second before I moved. A shape, an impression, gone before it resolved. Peter came in with a single page. Broadcast clearance. They need the signature to go live from the floor. I signed it without sitting down, without reading past the line I already knew, and handed it back. "That's the last one," he said. "Everything else is already dry." He took the page and left. On my desk, the term sheet lay where I'd set it at 1 in the morning, a small yellow flag now marking the last page, the page with the signature block, the one that in a few hours would stop being a draft and start being the reason a television anchor said my name. Through the glass wall, the floor was already moving. Analysts at screens, a partner on a headset walking a slow lap, the low hum of a room where a great deal of money changes its mind quietly and on schedule. None of them looked at me differently this morning. To them, this was a Wednesday with a signing on it. They had been treating me like the number on the page for 11 years. It was only the rest of the world that was about to be introduced. I caught myself in the dark of the window, the suit, the cuffs, a man who looked exactly like what he was, for once. Somewhere a woman I'd shared a bed with for 14 months was, at that same moment, deciding for good that this man did not exist. I let the thought pass through without holding it. Some things are true whether or not you stop to feel them. Across town, because I'll tell you what she was doing, even though I couldn't see it and wouldn't have watched if I could, Clara was typing my name into a search bar. Not my name, my company. The one I'd mentioned once, vaguely, months ago, the way you mention a job that bores you. She typed it in and waited. She got a dry cleaning chain in another state, a dead LinkedIn from a job 3 roles ago. A man with the same common company name who, as far as the internet was concerned, sold boats. Nothing that looked like money. Nothing that looked like a threat. Nothing that contradicted the story she'd already filed under closed. She scrolled to the second page of results, which no one does unless they need to be sure of something. Still nothing. She typed his actual name beside the company, a charity photo, 3 years old, a crowd of strangers in evening clothes. She almost recognized the event and didn't chase it. She closed the search. It confirmed her. That's the part I think about later, if I let myself. The emptiness of that search was the last thing that let her feel she'd been right. She had looked me up and found a man who sold boats. Whatever her father meant by moving, it had nothing to do with the calm nobody who'd let her go without a fight. She put the phone down. She was, for the first time in 12 hours, entirely out of things to do. Peter came back at 10:02. "Slots confirmed," he said. I didn't look up from the term sheet right away. "Good." He lingered half a second longer than the errand needed. "Anything you once said when they ask you for a comment?" "No." "They'll ask. Cameras, a live signing, a company this size. Someone will put a microphone in your face on the way out. Let them." He nodded once, satisfied. A man does not stay my partner for 11 years by needing me to explain my silences. He has built an entire career on the space I leave where other men would talk. He set a fresh copy of the broadcast schedule on the corner of the desk, square to the edge, because Peter cannot set a thing down crooked any more than he can say goodbye. I looked up at the clock on the wall. Peter looked at the same clock. We both looked at it for a second, the two of us, in a quiet room, watching a minute hand that didn't care what it was about to set off, and then he picked up the document he'd come in for and walked out, and I went back to reading the page I already knew by heart. It was almost 6. Across the city, in a well-lit kitchen, a woman was waiting for an hour to settle. In another room, a man she trusted was pacing a hallway, losing the day of the week, unable to stop a thing he could not yet name. Neither of them had turned on the television yet. It was still just furniture in the corner, dark and patient. In a few minutes, someone would reach for the remote out of habit, the way you do on a slow morning when you're waiting for news you assume will be about someone else. It was about to be about them. All of it, at once, on live television, in front of no one in that apartment who could do a single thing to stop it. Part 4. At 6 o'clock, I sat down at a long table under a row of cameras and signed my name. That was all it was, in the end. A pen, a page, a line I'd read 1,000 times. The nib caught once on the paper, and I smoothed it and kept going, the same hand that had made coffee 2 nights ago while a woman decided I was finished. No shaking it. There was nothing in me to shake. Across the table, the other signatures went down in order. Peter stood 1 step behind my shoulder, exactly 1 step, the way he has stood for 11 years, close enough to hand me a pen, far enough to stay out of the frame. Behind us, on the wall of monitors, the chyron changed. It put up my name. Beside it, the fund's Ardent Capital Partners, the name Clara had searched for at 7 that morning and not found. Beneath that, the company being acquired, Corven Holding Group, and the number. $1.2 billion spelled out clean across the bottom of the screen for anyone in the country who happened to be watching the business channel with their coffee. I shook the hand across the table. Cameras moved. It was done. A journalist stepped in as I stood, young, sharp, already reaching with her recorder. Mr. Ethan, any comment on what this means for Corven's current leadership, for the board? I smiled at her. I said nothing. She asked me for a quote. I smiled. Peter had already given her one an hour ago, cleared and printed and dull as a tax form. That is what Peter is for. I am for signatures and silence, and I had just spent my 1 signature of the morning. She waited a polite second for me to fill the space. I didn't. People find the silence unnerving. They always try to fill it themselves, and what they fill it with is usually more honest than anything I could have said. Thank you, I told her, which meant nothing, and walked out past the cameras with Peter a step behind and left my own name glowing on a wall of screens in a building I would not need to visit again. Somewhere across the city, 2 televisions were on in 2 rooms. Neither of the people in those rooms was watching yet. That was about to change. Clara was crossing Edward's living room with an empty cup when the name on the television stopped her. She wasn't watching it. It was just on, the business channel, low volume, the wallpaper of a rich man's morning. But her eyes snagged on the chyron the way an eye snags on your own name in a crowd, and she stopped in the middle of the room and read it. Ethan, the fund name. And under it, a company name she knew the way you know your childhood address. Corven Holding Group. Her father's. The thing above everything her family had. She read it again. She read it a 3rd time, lips moving slightly, sounding it out like a woman checking a word she must have misspelled. On the screen, his photo came up in the B-roll. Same face, a suit she'd never seen, a room she'd never seen. His hand going across a page, calm, unhurried, the exact calm she'd watched him wear at the kitchen table and mistaken for shock. The anchor's voice went on underneath it, even and pleased, the way business anchors sound when a number is large enough to be entertainment. A landmark acquisition. Ardent Capital taking a controlling position in the Corven Group. Analysts had expected consolidation in the sector, but few had expected it this cleanly, this fast, or this quietly assembled. Quietly assembled. Clara heard those 2 words and felt something turn over in her stomach that she could not yet give a name to. Her thumb was already moving before the rest of her caught up. She opened her phone. She went to his name, gray, blocked, the shape she'd made herself just before midnight. She unblocked it. Her hands were not quite steady now. She pressed call. Nothing. Not a ring. Not a voicemail. A dead, flat, immediate nothing. The sound a line makes when it has been closed from the other side. She looked at the phone. She pressed call again. Dead line. He had blocked her. Sometime in the last 31 hours, the calm man who sold boats had reached into his own phone and closed her out first, before the broadcast, before her father's call, before any of it. She had unblocked him. He had already blocked her. The order of those 2 acts was going to live in her chest for a long time. Edward, she said, not loudly. He came out of the kitchen with his own phone already lit in his hand, and for 1 second, before he saw the television, his face was the face of a man managing 3 fires. Then his eyes went to the screen, to the chyron, to the number. His phone rang in his hand. He looked at it. She saw the name flash, 3 letters, his CFO, and it changed him. The last of the morning's performance drained out of his face and left something older and tighter underneath. "Yes," he said into the phone, clipped, and turned and walked toward the hallway. "Yes, I'm looking at it now. I'm looking at it right now." A pause. His free hand went flat against the wall. No, that's not. When did the covenant get called? Who signed off on? He caught himself, glanced once at Clara, and dropped his voice below hearing. Whatever the CFO was telling him, he was learning it at the same moment the whole country was. The man who managed every room had just found out he'd been the last one in his own to know. He did not ask Clara if she was all right. He did not look at her again. She stood alone in the middle of the living room with a dead phone in her hand and her father's holding company, scrolling across a stranger's broadcast. And behind her, patient as ever, the television kept saying his name. She tried everything after that. People do. She pressed his number by hand, digit by digit, the way you dial when you've decided the blocked contact must be a glitch and the real number will somehow behave differently. Her thumb hovered over the green button. She counted, without meaning to, 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds before she pressed it. Deadline. She opened her email and typed his work address from memory, because 14 months ago she'd sent his office a birthday delivery and the address had stuck. She wrote 3 lines. She did not read them back. She sent them. The reply came in under a minute. Automatic. Cool. Perfect. Mr. Ethan is unavailable for personal communications. She stared at it. Not a bounce. Not an error. A wall, built in advance, worded by someone whose entire job was to be polite to people exactly like her. She called information and got the firm's main line, Ardent Capital, a real number, a real switchboard, the money her search had failed to find that morning, suddenly answering on the second ring. Ardent Capital, good morning. I need to reach Ethan. It's Vinga. I'm a friend. It's personal. He's in meetings all morning. The voice was warm, a woman's, unhurried, kind in the specific way that gives you nothing. May I take a message? Just, Vinga, tell him Clara called. He'll know. Please, Clara. Of course, I'll be sure he receives it. Warm, final. A door closing so gently you almost thanked it. Have a good morning. The line went quiet. She sat with the phone against her ear a second after it had gone dead, the way you do when you're not ready to admit a conversation is over. Then she lowered it. That was the one that did it, I think. Not the dead number, not the broadcast, but the warmth. A stranger being kind to her on his behalf, from inside a world she hadn't known existed, holding a door she'd walked out of herself 30 hours before. The wall wasn't cold. That was the cruelty of it. Cold, she could have argued with. This was polite and complete, and it had clearly been standing there long before she ever thought to push on it. Her phone was still in her hand when the browser, still open on the press release, caught her eye. She read a line of it without meaning to. Legal language, dense, the kind you skim, pursuant to the debt restructuring agreement, dated, and then a date. And she registered the date the way you register a number on a sign you're driving past, there and gone, meaning nothing yet. It would mean something in a day. She closed it. The phone buzzed in her hand. Her father. She looked at the name and then, because she had no sentence ready for him, because whatever he was going to say she was not ready to hear, she let it ring out. It went to voicemail. She did not listen to it. She would, later, alone, and it would be short and flat and end with the words, "Things have changed." And she would understand then that her father had known before she did. That he had said, "Don't do anything today and stay where you are," because he was already somewhere she wasn't. But that was later. For now, she just watched the little red dot appear beside his name and let it sit there, unheard, one more thing in the room she wasn't ready to pick up. Down the hall, Edward's voice rose and fell, counsel on the line now, the words too low to catch. He came halfway back into the room, saw her sitting there with her phone, and lifted one hand at her, not now, before she could speak. Then he was gone again. She sat on the couch. The television was still on. The Chiron had updated, the press release headline crawling along the bottom now, her father's company's name in it twice. She was, for the second time in one morning, entirely out of things to do. So she did the thing you do when your hands need a job and your mind won't hold still. She reached for her bag. She was looking for nothing in particular, gum, a charger, a card, anything. She pushed past her wallet, past the lipstick, past the small archaeology of a life packed in a hurry the night before, and her fingers found paper. Folded, soft at the creases from months in the bottom of the bag. She drew it out without thinking. A program. Cream cardstock, an embossed crest, the name of a charity gala from 7050. She had to place it, big months ago. The boring one. the one he'd made her go to, where she'd spend the evening on her phone and let him talk to strangers and complain the whole ride home about her feet. She almost put it back. She opened it instead, idly, the way you open a thing already on its way to the trash. The front, the event, the date, a list of the evening's speakers she hadn't listened to. She turned the page. She turned another. The back page was the sponsors. There were tiers of them, in ascending size and importance, the way these things are always arranged. Her eye went up the ladder without interest until it reached the top, the largest print, the line reserved for the people who had paid for the entire room. Presenting sponsors. And there, in clean small capitals, was his name, and beside it, the fund. Ardent Capital Partners. The same name that had been on the Chiron 4 minutes ago. The same name the warm woman on the phone had answered with. The same name Clara had typed into a search bar at 7 that morning and decided did not exist. She read it once. She read it again. She had been in the room. She had held this program in her own hands months ago and flipped past this page to check the time on her phone. His name had been on the back of it the entire evening, the entire ride home, the entire time it sat folded in the bottom of her bag while she blocked him and toasted with champagne she hadn't asked for and poured a second coffee down a stranger's drain. He lied to me. The sentence arrived fast, ready-made, the way the useful ones always do. He lied to me. He let me believe he was nothing. He hid all of it, on purpose, and let me walk into this. So really, when you looked at it clearly, this was his fault. She held on to that for a moment. It was a good sentence. It had somewhere to put the blame. Then her eyes went back to the cream cardstock in her hand, and the sentence would not stand up on it. He hadn't hidden this. He'd handed it to her. He'd taken her to the room, put the program in her hand, introduced her to strangers whose names she hadn't bothered to keep. She had been the one who didn't read to the back. She had not been lied to. That was the part that would not sit down. She had been handed the truth on cream cardstock and found it boring. She set the program down on the couch beside her. Then she picked it up again. She could not seem to put it back in the bag. Behind her, the television went on saying his name. Down the hall, Edward stood alone with his back to the wall and a journalist on his personal cell. He knew this call. He had taken 100 like it. The reporter who gets your private number, who catches you in the 10 minutes before your counsel does, who wants a reaction while the reaction is still raw enough to be a headline. He knew you were supposed to say nothing. He also knew, the way men who have always managed the room know, that he was better at this than most. "Look," he said, smooth, reasonable, the voice he used for boards. "Let's not be dramatic about it. Restructurings happen. Anyone who's followed Corvin's debt position for the last year saw the covenant terms were going to force a conversation eventually. This is a conversation, that's all." He said it to sound calm. It landed as something else. Because Edward had spent the last month telling his own board, in his own words, that he was unaware of any weakness in those covenant terms. And here he was, on a recorded line, telling a journalist that the terms had been visible for a year to anyone who looked. He didn't hear the contradiction. Men rarely hear their own. "And your position on the board of Corvin?" the journalist pressed, gently, the way you press when the subject is doing your work for you. "Given the change in control?" "My position is exactly what it's been," Edward said, and here the old confidence carried him past the edge before he saw the edge. "I've been across these terms from the beginning. Nobody understands the Corvin structure better than I do. If anything, I expect the board will want steadier hands now, not fewer." From the beginning. Across these terms from the beginning. He said it to sound indispensable. He had just put his own knowledge on record at the exact place his board minutes swore he had none. His PR contact was already calling through. He could feel the phone stutter against his ear with the second line, but the words were out, and the recorder had them, and some things cannot be pulled back through the small hole they came out of. Across the city, in a quiet office, Peter was watching the statement post in real time on a screen. He read it once. He did not smile. Peter does not spend expressions he can keep. He took a screenshot. He checked the timestamp against the record already sitting in the file, the month-old board minutes where Edward had claimed, on the record, that he had no knowledge of any weakness in the covenant terms, and he saw the two statements line up like a key in a lock. 1 month ago, to his board, "I knew nothing." This morning, to a journalist, anyone who looked could see it coming. Both his, both filed. A man cannot stand in two places at once, but Edward had just put it in writing that he had. His phone rang. The PR contact, breathless, wanting to retract, wanting the statement treated as never given. Peter let it connect. He looked at the screenshot a second longer. "We have it," he said, and hung up. and forwarded the image to the legal team with no note attached, because none was needed. Back in the hallway, Edward's phone finally buzzed with the press release alert. He opened it. He read the headline. He read it a second time, standing very still against the wall, and for the first time that morning, for the first time maybe in 3 years, his face did the thing he had spent a career making sure his face never did. It showed him something he could not fix. Part 5. By mid-morning, Clara had moved to the window and Edward had moved to the kitchen, and the apartment had quietly rearranged itself into two people not looking at each other. He made a call I only heard about later, but I've made enough of them from the other side to tell you exactly how it went. He dialed Clara's father. He did it the way you reach for a tool you've used 100 times and never once found dull. The family owed him. That was the fixed point Edward had built a career on top of. When you hold a man's cash flow, you hold his signature, and you can call it in on a bad morning like ordering a car. I need a counter-objection on the acquisition notice, Edward said. Sign today. It buys us a review window. I'll have my people send the language over within the hour. There was a silence on the line, not a hesitation. A different kind of quiet. The quiet of a man who already knew this call was coming and had decided weeks ago what he'd say. I won't be signing anything, Clara's father said. I signed a cooperation agreement 3 weeks ago. Edward's voice did not change, not yet. A cooperation agreement with whom? The father said the name. Ardent Capital, Ethan's fund. Nothing on Edward's end for a moment. In the kitchen he stood very still, the phone against his ear, a man recalculating a room he thought he owned. My attorney was briefed in advance, the father went on, flat, unhurried, a businessman reading out a settled fact. It's done, Edward, it's been done. I'd have told you sooner, but I was advised not to. You understand advice. Edward tried the only lever he had left. You understand what happens to your operating line if I stop carrying it. You understand what a review window would buy you. I'm offering to help you, the way I've always. You've always helped me at 8% and a standing seat at my table, the father said, and for the first time something almost like tiredness came into his voice. The new people helped me by owning the paper outright and not needing anything from my daughter to do it. It's a better deal, Edward. It was always going to be a better deal. Don't call again about this. The line went dead in Edward's hand. He set the phone on the marble. He didn't slam it. He straightened, tugged his cuffs down, ran a thumb along one lapel and then the other, smoothing a jacket that did not need smoothing. Edward fixed his lapels. That is how you always know a man has finally run out of moves. He stops reaching for the phone and starts adjusting his collar, as if the problem were ever the way the jacket sat. Clara watched him do it from the doorway. She didn't say anything. She had spent 3 years reading Edward Collins as the calmest man in any room, and she was learning, in real time, that the calm had always been a jacket he kept pressed. Underneath it was just a man, and the man was afraid. His phone rang again, the CFO. He answered it, because answering was the only forward motion left to him. Say it again, Edward said, and then, quieter, when was the covenant dated? He listened. Whatever the number was, it landed on him like a slow weight. 14 months. The restructuring agreement that had just eaten his company was dated 14 months ago, signed and filed before Ethan had ever taken Clara to a boring gala, before Edward had ever poured a competitor's champagne, before any of the moves any of them thought they were making. The thing had been sitting under the floor of Edward's world for over a year, and he had stopped reading the floor. Send it to my personal email, he said, and hung up. He had spent his life screening the world for threats, and he had screened for the wrong thing. He looked for titles, for connections, for the visible weight of money in a room. Ethan wore cheap shoes to a decoy office and let people underestimate him for a living. Edward never saw him, because Edward only ever saw what he was used to seeing. That is not stupidity. It is a very expensive habit, and Edward had just been handed the bill for it. Clara stayed in the doorway, watching the man she'd chosen learn the shape of his own morning. He set his coffee down on the table and crossed to the window, phone already lifting to his ear for the next call, and he left the cup there, half full, going cold. She looked at it for a long moment. 3 years, and she had never once seen Edward Collins leave a cup of coffee unfinished. He was the man who finished things. That was the entire brand of him, the reason she'd walk toward his open door instead of anyone else's. And there it sat, abandoned on the table, still steaming. The morning before, in this same kitchen, she had watched him leave a cup exactly like that and felt only a small, cold flicker of wrongness she couldn't name. She could name it now. It was fear. And it had been his before it was hers, and it had spread across the apartment like a draft under a door she'd thought she'd closed behind her. She said nothing. There was nothing to say to a frightened man that wouldn't make you feel the floor under yourself go soft too. Clara's phone rang while she was still at the window. Her father. She answered it fast, faster than she meant to, because some part of her had been waiting all morning for one person to call and make the ground stop tilting. Dad. Clara. His voice was flat in the way she'd heard once that morning and hoped she'd imagined. Ethan's fund has taken control of the holding structure. I wanted you to hear it directly from me, not off a television. Okay. When did this? How? I knew several weeks ago. I signed the cooperation agreement with his team. No apology in it, no softening, just a man laying down a card he'd been holding face down for a long time. You knew. She heard her own voice go thin. You knew for weeks, and you didn't. A silence. He let it sit there. Then, call me when you've had some time. He hung up. Clara stood with the phone against her ear after the line was already dead. His name stayed lit on the screen, the call-ended clock counting up in small grey numbers. She watched it. 10 seconds. 20. 30. She did not take the phone from her ear, and she did not put it down. Because the thing her father had not said was louder than anything he had. He had known for 3 weeks. He had signed with Ethan's people. And in all those weeks, while she performed concern for 40 seconds, while she pocketed a key, while she toasted with champagne, her own father had said nothing to her. Not because he was protecting her, because when the two things sat on the same scale, the deal weighed more than her position, and he had simply, quietly, chosen the heavier one. That silence was its own verdict, and it had her family's signature on it. She lowered the phone at last. On the television across the room, the broadcast was still cycling, Ethan's fund name riding the lower third of the screen like a headline that refused to scroll away. For a moment, she tried to be angry at her father, because anger was somewhere to stand. But it kept sliding off him and landing back on her. He had made a business decision, the same kind of clear-eyed, unsentimental, realistic decision she had built her entire self-image on being able to make. She had blocked a man in 4 hours to protect her position. Her father had signed a paper in 3 weeks to protect his. They were the same animal. She'd just never been on the losing side of it before, and she was discovering, this morning, that the family talent for choosing the profitable exit did not feel nearly so admirable when you were the exit. She sat down. She did not ask Edward anything. There was nothing Edward could give her now that she'd want, and they both, in their separate corners of that beautiful apartment, had just finished learning the same lesson about how little they'd actually been holding. She stayed on the couch a long time before she reached for her phone again, and when she did, it wasn't to call anyone. It was to do a piece of arithmetic she already knew the answer to and needed to see anyway. She opened the news app. She found the press release. She looked at the timestamp on the filing, 6 o'clock in the morning. Then she opened her own phone log, the blocked contacts list, the small administrative record of the moment she decided a man was finished. It was there, stamped to the minute, the way phones stamp everything, 11:47 the night before. She sat with the two numbers, 11:47 at night, 6 o'clock the next morning. 6 hours and 13 minutes between the moment she closed the door on Ethan and the moment his name went up on live television over her father's company. And underneath both of those numbers, older than either, was the one the CFO had read to Edward in the kitchen. 14 months. The agreement that made all of it possible had been signed and waiting since before Ethan ever asked her to dinner twice. She had thought she was making a choice. She had blocked him at 11:47 with the clean, efficient feeling of a woman removing a liability from her books. And the machine that would make her wrong had already been running for over a year. Her choice hadn't started it. Her choice hadn't stopped it. Her choice hadn't touched it at all. She had stepped off a train she thought she was driving and watched it arrive exactly on schedule without her. The worst part wasn't that she'd been fooled. She could have lived with being fooled. Being fooled makes you a victim, and victims get to be angry. The worst part was that no one had fooled her. He hadn't lied about the deal. He'd never mentioned it, because a man closing $1 billion acquisition does not brief his girlfriend of 14 months on the covenant math, and he'd have been a fool too. She hadn't been kept in the dark. She'd simply never been standing close enough to the center of his life to see the light that was already on in it. That was a colder thing than betrayal. Betrayal at least assumes you mattered enough to deceive. She opened the message to Ethan. She typed. She deleted. She typed again. What came out wasn't an apology and wasn't an accusation. It was some unfinished thing in between. A few lines that started with "I don't know if you'll ever" and trailed off before they decided what she didn't know. She read it. She did not send it. She could not send it. The channel was closed on his end, sealed by the same quiet hand that had closed everything else. And even if some door had been left open, she had no ending for the sentence. What do you write to a man you priced out at 11:47 when the market corrects at 6? Sorry was too small and too late and, worse, not quite true, she was not sorry, she tried to be realistic. She was only sorry it had cost her this much to find out she'd been wrong about the numbers. So she took a screenshot of it instead, a photograph of a message that would never be delivered, proof, for no one but herself, that she had at least once put the words in an order and looked at them. She did not delete the screenshot. She would keep it a long time, the way you keep a receipt for a thing you can no longer return. Then she set the phone face down on the couch beside her. She did not know that she had just made, exactly, the gesture Ethan had made 2 nights before at his own table, the quiet turning over of a phone, the small act of a person who has finished with a thing and has nowhere left to put it. He had done it to close a door. She was doing it because every door was already closed. Across the city, in a quiet office, the same math was sitting on my desk. Peter set the printed release down in front of me and put one finger on the timestamp, the way he points at a thing when he wants me to notice he isn't going to say anything about it. The math's in the release, I said. I know. We both looked at it a second. 6 a.m. filed. A date 14 months back in the fine print. The whole story, if you wanted to read it, told in 2 numbers and a silence. People were going to call it revenge. They always do. Is the cleaner story. But it wasn't. The deal had been there before she left. It was going to close whether she blocked me at 11:47 or kissed me goodnight and meant it. Edward thought he owned the company. He owned the chair. I owned the building and had for over a year, and none of that had anything to do with a 40-second hug. She just happened to walk out the night before the lights came on. That was all. That was the whole cruelty of it, and I hadn't arranged a minute of the timing. I picked up the term sheet for the next thing and went back to reading. Peter took the release and left. Somewhere across the city, a phone lay face down on a couch, and I didn't know it was there, and it wouldn't have changed the page I was on if I had. Part 6. By that afternoon, Edward had built himself a working desk in the corner of the apartment, the way men like him always do when the ground moves. They reach for the posture of a busy office, as if a laptop and a legal pad could put the floor back. His PR contact called him there. I heard the shape of it later, and it went the way these calls always go. Too late, and very polite about it. I need you to understand, this isn't a normal news cycle, the man said. The statement you gave this morning, we've been trying to pull it back all day. It was a routine professional comment, Edward said. Nothing in it 100 spokesmen wouldn't have said. It's not the comment, it's that the comment doesn't match your board minutes. A pause on the line, the sound of a man choosing soft words for a hard fact. You told your board, in writing, you had no knowledge of any weakness in the covenant. This morning, you told a reporter the weakness was visible for a year to anyone who looked. Both are on the record now. People are already lining the two up. Edward was quiet for a moment. Then unline them. Walk it back. Issue a clarification. We've reached out. They already have it on the record. There's no unringing it, Edward. I'm sorry. Then bury it. Feed them something bigger. You've done it before. With respect, bury it under what? You're the story. $1 billion takeover of a company you sit on the board of, and a quote that contradicts your own minutes. The man exhaled. There's no bigger thing to trade them. You are the bigger thing this week. Edward was quiet. Then, more to himself than to the phone, who's asking about the minutes, specifically? Everyone, now. But it started with a request from your own board's counsel this afternoon. They pulled the file. Someone flagged the discrepancy before we did. A careful pause. Edward, whoever's driving this already had your minutes lined up next to your statement before either of us saw it coming. This wasn't sloppy on your end. It was fast on theirs. Edward set the phone down on his new desk without a word and looked at the wall for a while, a man recounting his own pockets and finding one of them already cut, neatly, by a hand he never felt. Across the city, in a quieter room, Peter leaned into my doorway with a page in his hand. The statement's in the record, he said, filed and matched. Their own PR just confirmed they can't retract it. I didn't look up from the document I was reading. Good. Peter picked up the next file off the corner of my desk and went back to work. And that was the entire conversation, because between the two of us, that was the entire event. A fact arriving, a fact received, a page turned. Somewhere across town, a man was learning his own words had grown teeth. Here, it was a Wednesday afternoon, with one item checked off a very long list. People assume, when a thing like this lands, that there must be a moment of satisfaction, a lean back in the chair, a private smile at a screen. There wasn't. I have never once found a satisfying part, and I've stopped looking for it. Edward had told his board one thing and a reporter another, entirely on his own, in his own voice, on his own phone. All my morning required of me was that I not interrupt him. The rest of the day I spent on the next deal, which did not know or care what Corvin's headline was, because the next deal never does. That is the whole trick, if you want it. Stay out of reactive mode. The man in reactive mode is the one supplying the evidence. You just have to be somewhere else, reading something else, when he does. Then Edward did the thing that finished him, and he did it believing it was the thing that would save him. He decided to fight it procedurally. He had spent his whole life in rooms with rules, and rooms with rules had always belonged to him. So he reached for the rule book the way a drowning man reaches for the thing floating nearest, without checking whether it floats. He called his two most reliable board members. I can tell you almost exactly how he pitched it, because Edward pitched everything the same way, warm and certain and slightly ahead of your objection. I want to convene a session, he told the first. Nothing dramatic, a review of acquisition procedure. This Ardent business, it's aggressive creditor overreach, and if we don't put a formal question mark on how it was executed, we're setting a precedent none of us wants to live under. I'd like the board on the record raising the concern, properly, by the book. A review. The member's voice was even. You want to open the floor to a full review of the acquisition? I want us on record, that's all. A clean procedural objection. On record. A short pause, the kind Edward had spent 30 years reading as agreement. You know that once we open it, it's open. Everything's in scope. The covenant history, the board's prior briefings, all of it, on the table, minuted. That's rather the point, Edward said, warm, certain. Transparency protects us. Then I'll be there, the member said. Wouldn't miss it. Edward heard a yes and hung up pleased. He did not hear the small dry thing riding underneath wouldn't miss it. The sound of a man buying a ticket to a demolition he has just been told is his own. He called the second member and got the same yes, warmer still, and the same thing hiding under it that he could not hear because he had never once in his life had to listen for it. Both of them said yes, warmly and quickly, and told him they thought a session was exactly right, and Edward heard agreement, because that is what he was listening for. He did not hear the other thing underneath it, which was two men who had read the same broadcast he had, seen the same inconsistency the whole market had, and wanted very much to be in the room when Edward Collins explained himself. He called his assistant last. Schedule a board session, day after tomorrow morning. Send the agenda to all members by this evening. List the acquisition review as the first item and put me down to open. A pause. And confirm the records attached. I want everyone reading from the same page. The same page. He asked for it himself. The invitation went out that evening under his own assistant's signature, agenda attached, record attached, the acquisition review sitting at the top of the list in his own confident wording. Edward sat back in his borrowed office posture, and if you'd been in the room, you might have heard him say it, half to himself, the way a man reassures himself with a maxim. Rules exist for exactly this kind of moment. He invoked parliamentary procedure to save himself. Edward Collins, who once told me at a dinner, smiling, that rules are for people who can't afford alternatives, reached for Robert's Rules of Order and used them, clause by clause, to build the room he would be voted out of. He set the date, he wrote the agenda, he attached the record. He booked the chair he would not be sitting in by the end of it. I was not on the invitation list. I am not a board member of Corvin. I am the reason there is a Corvin to have a board of. In Edward's agenda, I appeared exactly once, 3 words in the second line. The acquiring party. He circulated a document about me to a room I would never enter and asked everyone to read from the same page and never once considered that I might have written it. I did not respond to the invitation. There was nothing to respond to. You don't RSVP to a room where your work is already sitting on every chair. While Edward built his session, Clara was doing something smaller and, in its way, sadder. He had gone into the other room to make more calls, and she was alone at his desk with her phone and the quiet, and she opened the screenshot she'd taken the night before, the message she'd written to Ethan and could not send, the one that started with, "I don't know if you'll ever," and went nowhere after that. She read it again. Then she did a thing she couldn't have explained if you'd asked her. She opened a blank document on Edward's computer and typed the message into it, word for word, off her own phone screen. Then she hit print. The printer in the corner woke up with an absurd, cheerful mechanical racket, loud as a lawnmower in the hush of that apartment, chewing and rolling and finally offering up a single sheet, still warm, with her unsendable words on it in a plain black font that made them look official, permanent, like a document that mattered. For a second she nearly lunged for it. The sound was so loud in that hush that it felt like being caught, like Edward would appear in the doorway and ask what she was printing on his machine. But he didn't come. He was deep in his own call in the other room, building his session, and the printer finished its cheerful racket and fell silent, and no one had heard a thing. She picked it up. She read it once more on paper, and on paper it was somehow worse and better at the same time, realer, heavier, a thing with weight now instead of a ghost behind glass. Her own handwriting would have looked like grief. This looked like a memo. Somehow the plainness of the font was the cruelest part. It made the words look like they belonged to a functioning adult who had their situation under control, which was the one thing she no longer was. She folded it in thirds, carefully, the way you fold a letter you intend to mail. Then she crossed to the chair where her jacket hung, the same jacket she'd arrived in 2 nights ago, worn over the same shoulders that had carried a stranger's key across the city. And she slid the folded page into the inside pocket, over the place where a heart is supposed to be. And she left it there. A letter with no address. A message to a sealed line. She knew it would never arrive. She carried it anyway. Because carrying it was the only remaining verb available to her. And a person in bargaining will take any verb they can still perform. There is a stage when a thing is truly lost, where the mind stops trying to win it back and starts only trying to be on record about it. Not to the other person, to the universe, to some imagined future in which it matters that you at least felt the right thing at the end, even if you felt it too late and to no one. That was the stage Clara had reached at that desk. She was not writing to Ethan. She had understood somewhere in the last day that there was no Ethan to write to anymore, only a name on a building and a warm assistant who would never let her words get past the lobby. She was writing to the record, printing a copy for the file, filing her own small statement into a case that had already been decided so that at least one page in it would be hers. Edward's call ended in the other room. He came to the doorway, phone still in his hand, already somewhere past her. "The session's scheduled," he said. "Day after tomorrow." "What session?" "Board. It's procedure. Nothing you need to worry about." And he was gone again, back to the phone, back to the machine he was so proud of building. Clara looked at the jacket on the chair, at the small square of extra weight now folded over its heart, and said nothing. There was a session scheduled that she didn't understand, in a room she'd never see, about a company that used to be her family's, run by a man who was about to lose it in a way he couldn't yet imagine. And she, who had walked out of the only life that would have kept her clear of all of it, stood in the middle of the wreckage carrying a letter she couldn't send to the one person who'd seen the whole thing coming and never once raised his voice about it. She sat back down at his desk with the jacket behind her and let the afternoon go quiet. And for a while she just watched the little cursor blink on the blank document she'd printed from, the one thing on that screen that had been, however briefly, hers. 2 days ago she had believed she was a person who made clean, unsentimental decisions and never got caught on the wrong side of one. In 2 days she had blocked the wrong man, toasted the wrong future, and printed a letter to a sealed line on a printer that wasn't hers, in an apartment that wasn't hers, over a heart that no longer seemed to know what it wanted, except to undo a thing that could not be undone. Bargaining, it turns out, does not always look like begging. Sometimes it just looks like a woman folding a page very neatly and putting it somewhere warm, so that at least one copy of what she felt exists in the world, even if the world will never read it. Everything in that apartment now belonged to Edward. The desk, the agenda, the session, the date, the room. Everything was his, everything except the outcome. Part 7. The next morning, the day before his session, Edward did the last thing a man in his position does. He called me. Not the fund, not counsel. Me, directly, on the private line he'd somehow dug up overnight, because Edward Collins had spent his whole life believing that every closed door has a person behind it who can be reached if you know how to knock. The first call went to voicemail on the second ring, which is what a line does when a man is looking at your name and choosing not to answer, though Edward would not have read it that way. Edward would have assumed a meeting, a signal, a busy morning. He hung up without leaving a message, the way you do when you'd rather compose yourself than be caught improvising. I picture him in his hallway. I've been in enough hallways with him to furnish the scene. Jacket on before 9, coffee going cold on the desk behind him, the way it did now. Straightening his sleeve, running the opening line in his head, the same instinct that had carried him through 30 years of rooms. Get the tone right, and the room will follow. He believed the tone still mattered. He believed there was still a room. He waited a full minute. Then he called again. This time he left a message. I never heard it, but Peter did. And Peter gave me the shape of it, and the shape was this. A calm, professional man offering to be reasonable. I think there's a version of this that works for everyone, Edward said into a machine in the measured voice he used for boards. I believe we can find a solution that benefits all parties, a mutually beneficial arrangement. Call me back at this number and let's talk before things become unnecessarily adversarial. A pause. It's Edward Collins. He said his own name at the end, slowly, as if the problem might be that I didn't know who was calling. As if the man who had just spent $1.2 billion to own the ground Edward stood on might not place the name. Across the city, Peter watched the two entries appear in the call log, timestamps 1 minute apart. He played the second voicemail. 15 seconds in, he stopped it. He didn't need the rest. The first sentence had already told him everything a courtroom would ever want to know about what Edward still believed. He tagged one word to the legal team and hit send. Filed. That was the whole of it, on our end. A man drafted a careful, dignified offer to negotiate the ownership of a building he no longer stood in, recorded it in his own voice, and mailed it straight into evidence. He thought he was opening a conversation. He was signing an exhibit. That is the thing people never understand about a man like Edward until it is far too late. His entire life had trained him to treat a hard morning as a negotiation, because for him, every hard morning always had been. A creditor calls, you renegotiate. A partner balks, you sweeten. A door shuts, you find the man behind it and you make him an offer. It had worked so completely for so long that it had stopped being a strategy and become a reflex, and reflexes don't check whether the situation has changed. He wasn't slow. He was simply doing, with real skill, the one thing that could not help him, talking to a door that was not a door, but a wall, and had been a wall for 14 months. While Edward negotiated with the machine, Clara tried the last door she had. She called the firm's main line from the window of Edward's apartment, the city spread out grey and indifferent below her. Ardent Capital, good morning. The same warm voice from the day before. Clara knew before she opened her mouth how it would end. She asked anyway. I need to speak to Ethan, please. It's personal. He's unavailable for personal communications. Warm, even. A wall with a pleasant finish. I can take a message if you'd like. Yes. Her voice caught and steadied. Yes, could you tell him? And there she stopped. She stood at the window with the phone against her ear and the sentence half out of her mouth, and she could not find the second half. Tell him what? That she was sorry she'd priced him wrong? That she'd found the program in her bag? That she'd printed a letter she couldn't send? None of it fit into a message left with a kind stranger who'd write it on a slip and set it, warm and complete, on top of a stack you would never reach the bottom of. Never mind, she said. Thank you. She hung up. She stayed at the window a long time after that, the phone held in both hands the way you hold something when you've forgotten it's there. She was not calling anyone else. There was no one else. The window was not a view she'd gone to admire. It was simply the place a person drifts to when every other direction in the room has quietly closed. 2 days ago she'd had a boyfriend, a benefactor, a family and a plan, and had considered herself the kind of woman who kept all four in careful order. Standing at the glass, she took a slow inventory and found the boyfriend blocked on his end, the benefactor down the hall taking calls he wouldn't share, the family on the far side of a signature 3 weeks old, and the plan, the clean, realistic, always land on the profitable side plan, folded into thirds and printed on a sheet of paper she couldn't deliver. 4 for 4. She had never in her life been this thoroughly, this quietly, this politely alone. She thought about her father. For one merciful hour the day before, she had let herself believe he hadn't warned her in order to protect her. Standing there, she finally let the kinder version go. He hadn't stayed silent to protect her. He'd stayed silent because, when the deal and his daughter's dignity sat on the same scale, he already knew which way it tipped, and he hadn't wanted the argument. His silence had never been a shield held in front of her. It had been a verdict passed behind her back, and she'd just been the last to be told the sentence. And under that, colder still, was the small arithmetic she couldn't stop running. If her father had known for 3 weeks, if the new people, as he'd put it, didn't need anything from his daughter to close their deal, then somewhere in those 3 weeks, her own value had quietly been marked down to 0 on a ledger she'd assumed she headed. She had thought she was the family's leverage, the warm asset that kept Edward generous. She had been, at most, a line item, and the moment a better number arrived, the line had been closed without a meeting. She had spent 2 nights being appalled at how quickly she'd blocked Ethan. She was only now catching up to how quickly and how quietly everyone else had blocked her. Outside, the city did nothing relevant at all. It never does, at the exact moment you most need it to look up. She caught her own reflection faintly in the glass, laid over the grey street below. A well-dressed woman in a beautiful apartment that wasn't hers, holding a phone that had run out of people to call. 3 nights ago, that reflection would have looked, to her, like a woman who had made the smart moves. She had traded up. She had chosen security. She had been, above all, realistic. Now the same reflection just looked like a person standing very still in someone else's kitchen, and she couldn't quite locate the moment the one picture had become the other. There hadn't been a moment. That was the thing she was only now beginning to understand. It had been decided in advance, months before, by numbers on paper she'd never asked to see, and all she'd done that first night was walk toward the outcome fast enough to feel like she'd chosen it. She stayed at the glass until her arm went stiff from holding the phone, and then a little longer, because putting it down meant admitting there was no reason to keep holding it. Peter came into my office a little after 8 with a page in his hand and set it on the corner of the desk. "The Hale voicemails are logged," he said. "Filed?" "Filed." I didn't look up from the term sheet. That was the entire conversation, and it was enough, because filed is the only word that matters for a thing like that. Everything else is decoration. Peter told me later the second voicemail was the better of the two, more measured, clearly drafted, the work of a man who'd thought about his phrasing. He'd said he believed we could find a solution that benefited all parties. Edward Collins, the man who once told me across a dinner table that rules are for people who can't afford alternatives, leaving a carefully worded voicemail at 7:40 in the morning, offering to be mutually beneficial to a man who had already filed a close at 6 the day before. I did not call him back. There was nothing to say, and anything I said would only become a second exhibit sitting next to his first. Silence isn't a strategy I chose against Edward. It's just the correct response to a question that has already been answered by the paperwork. I set the voicemail out of my mind the way you set down a glass, and I went back to the next thing. Peter lingered a second at the door, which for Peter is a whole speech. "He'll try one more angle before the session," he said. "Men like that always have one more angle." "Let him. Every angle he tries writes itself down." I turned the page. "He can't help it. He thinks he's still in the game because he's still allowed to move the pieces. Nobody's told him the board flipped over an hour before he sat down." "Somebody will," Peter said. "Tomorrow, in a room he booked himself." And that, from Peter, was practically a stand-up routine. He took his page and left. Across the city, Edward spent that evening getting ready. And here is the part I'll give him. He prepared honestly. He sat with a printed copy of his own agenda and hand-annotated it, line by line, building the case he would make to his board in the morning. He rehearsed his opening. He was not panicking anymore. He had a room, a date, a procedure, and a genuine, articulate argument, and he believed in it completely. You could almost admire it. He wrote out his points in a small, controlled hand. The aggressive creditor, the rushed transfer, the precedent no board should tolerate, and every one of them was a reasonable thing to say if you did not happen to know that the record already on every chair contained his own contradiction, in his own quoted words, with a timestamp. He was polishing an argument the way you polish silver you're about to hand to the man who's come to repossess it. The care he put into it was real. That was almost the worst part. A careless man might have stumbled into a defense. Edward built his cage with craftsmanship. He read his opening line aloud once to the empty room, adjusted a word, nodded to himself. He genuinely could not conceive of walking into a room he had summoned under rules he had invoked and losing. In his entire life, it had never once happened. He had no template for it, and so, like a man who has never seen snow, he could not picture the thing that was already falling. On the wall behind his desk, where he'd hung it years ago and walked past it 10,000 times since, there was a small frame certificate, an industry honor, a testimonial dinner, a company's name embossed in modest gold. He never read it anymore. You stop reading your own walls. If he had leaned in that night, he might have noticed that the company named on it had, some 14 months back, quietly become a subsidiary sitting inside the very structure Ardent Capital now owned outright. The evidence of exactly where he stood had been hanging over his own shoulder for years. He had dusted around it. He had walked guests past it and let them admire the frame. He had never once turned to read the small gold line that would have told him whose house he was really living in. He clicked off the hallway light, squared his notes on the desk, and straightened his jacket for the morning. The session was at 10. He walked into it, believing it was his. Part 8. The session opened at 10, in a room Edward had booked, under an agenda he had written, in front of a screen showing his own name at the top of the first item. I was not there. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I am not a director of Corven. I have never sat at that table. In the papers that came out of that morning, I appear exactly once, in the second line of the resolution, as 3 words: the acquiring party, a noun, not a man in the room. I heard how it went from people who were, and I'll tell it the way they told me, because the shape of it is the whole point. Edward was good. I'll give him that to the end. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and opened with the calm, reasonable voice that had carried him through 30 years of rooms exactly like this one. "I've called us together to raise a formal concern about the manner of the recent acquisition," he said. "Not the fact of it, the manner. What we've seen is aggressive creditor conduct, an accelerated transfer, a covenant interpretation I'd call irregular at best. I don't think any board in our position should let that pass into precedent without putting a question on the record. That's all I'm asking for today, that we ask the question, properly." It was a good opening, measured, reasonable. Around the table, heads did not nod, but they did not object, and to Edward that has always been the same thing. He went on for a few minutes more, and every minute of it was competent. He cited a precedent from another sector, a transfer that a different board had slowed with exactly this kind of procedural objection. He was careful not to sound wounded, careful not to attack the acquiring party by name, careful to frame the whole thing as protecting the institution rather than himself. He had learned long ago that the man who says, "I am defending all of us," survives rooms that the man who says, "I am defending myself," does not. He built his case brick by reasonable brick, and if you had walked in off the street and known nothing, you'd have thought him the steadiest person at the table. The trouble was that two of the people at the table were not strangers off the street. They were directors who had spent the previous night reading a covenant date and a line of filing language and had not slept especially well afterward. They watched Edward build his reasonable house, and they were thinking about the appendix, and they said nothing, because the quiet member to Edward's left had asked them, before he arrived, to let her handle it. Two of the three other directors had read the agenda materials the night before, the whole packet, including the reference that sat quietly in the appendix, a covenant date, and a line of filing language that neither of them had been able to stop thinking about since. They said nothing yet. They were waiting. The third director was a woman who had sat on the Corvan board longer than Edward had, quiet, precise, the kind of person who reads to the end of every document because she has been burned once by not doing it. She had a single printed page in front of her, face down. She let Edward finish. She let the silence after his remarks stretch one beat, two. Then she turned her page over and asked her question. "When did you become aware of the covenant's restructuring clause?" Edward answered smoothly. "It was standard operating covenant language. It's in every agreement of this kind." "That isn't what I asked." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I asked when you became aware of it. The standard review process would have. I'm not asking about the process. I'm asking about you." She laid her hand flat on the printed page. "Because I have a statement here, given by you to a reporter yesterday morning and published under your name, in which you say the covenant terms were visible for a year to anyone who cared to look. And I have, in our own minutes from last month, a statement, also yours, in which you tell this board you had no knowledge of any weakness in those terms." The room did not move. "So I'll ask a third time," she said, "and I'd like it in the record. When did you become aware?" And then she read the line from his statement aloud. His own words, in his own careful phrasing, in the flat, even voice of a woman reading someone else's sentence back to them. It did not take long. His sentences never did. That was part of what had always made them so effective. Read back to him across a boardroom table, that same economy became a noose exactly long enough. She set the page down when she'd finished and looked at him, not unkindly. "You understand the difficulty," she said. "It isn't the acquisition. Boards survive acquisitions. It's that we can't sit on a board with a member who tells us one thing in our minutes and the public another thing the same week and expect anyone, regulators, shareholders, the press already parked downstairs, to believe a word the rest of us sign. That's not about Ardent. That's about this table. You've made it about this table." The quiet that followed was the specific quiet of a room that has just understood something all at once and is waiting to see who says it first. Edward opened his mouth. He was still at that moment the most articulate man in the room. He had a career's worth of recoveries to reach for, and he reached. Over the shifa, I'm told you could see him reach, and found that every single one of them required saying a sentence that would contradict either the minutes or the statement, and that both were already on the table, in his own voice, with his own name on them. There was, for the first time in Edward Collins's professional life, nothing he could say that did not make it worse. I've thought about that moment more than any other in the whole affair, because it's the one I'd have paid to see and made certain I never would. Not the broadcast. This. A man who had spent 40 years being the most fluent person in every room he entered, discovering, in the one room he'd been most certain was his, that fluency was the thing that had done him in. Every graceful sentence he'd ever spoken had trained the table to believe he chose his words with care. So when two of his careful sentences turned out to point opposite directions, no one in that room could pretend it was an accident. Careful men don't get the accident defense. They spend their whole careers making sure of it, and then one Wednesday it makes sure of them. He said something finally. I'm told it started with, I think if we look at the context, and that he did not finish it because there was no context that survived contact with the two dates on the table, and some part of him, the part that had always known exactly when a room had turned, knew it before his sentence did. The quiet member folded her hands on top of the page. I'd like to table a motion, she said. Edward tried, of course. A man does not stop being himself because the floor has opened. I think we're getting ahead of ourselves, he said, and the smoothness was still there, only now you could hear the effort holding it up. I'd suggest a recess. Let counsel review the past, the framing here, before anyone tables anything we'll all regret. The chair doesn't see cause for a recess, said the director at the head of the table, one of the two who'd read the packet, no longer bothering to look neutral. The motion's been made. We'll hear it. Then I'd ask for a procedural review of the agenda before we... You said the agenda, Edward. The chair said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. This item is first on it because you put it first. We're simply taking it up. And there it was, the room he had booked, the rules he had invoked, the item he had ranked first with his own hand. Every lever he reached for turned out to be one he had installed himself, pointing the wrong way. The motion was read into the record. It cited the acquisition. It cited, in the flat language of these things, a restructuring agreement dated 14 months prior, the date sitting there on the screen at the front of the room, in a resolution nobody read aloud and everyone could see. It named the inconsistency between the public statement and the board minutes, and in its second line, as the reason all of this was now the board's problem, it named the acquiring party. Not me, the party. I was a fact the sentence had to mention, like a date on a form. The chair called the vote. All in favor? 3 hands. The quiet member, the chair, the second director who'd read the packet. Opposed? None. One director, the least committed of them, sat with his hands in his lap and abstained, which is what men do when they'd rather not be quoted either way, but have already decided which way the room is going. Even his abstention was a kind of vote, the vote of a man who has looked around the table, counted, and declined to be the only name standing next to a sinking one. The motion carries, the chair said. That was all. 2 words. After everything, the broadcast, the press release, the covenant 14 months deep, the voicemails at 7:40 in the morning, the whole institutional life of Edward Collins on that board ended in 2 words, read out in an even voice by a man passing him on the way to the next agenda item. Edward did not stand. He did not argue. He put one hand flat on the boardroom table, the way you steady yourself on a rail, and he looked at the grain of the wood in front of him, and he did not look up. He had run out of the one thing he had never in his life run out of before, which was a next sentence. He supplied the rope. He tied the knot. He booked the room and set the chair beneath it. Every move he'd made to protect himself had gone straight into the record, and the record was what removed him. I've turned that over more than once, the mechanics of it, because there's a lesson in it worth keeping. A man who panics quietly, who says nothing and does nothing, is often fine. Silence leaves no fingerprints. Edward's undoing was never fear. It was motion. Every single thing that removed him that morning was something he had reached out and done. The statement he volunteered to a reporter, the session he convened, the agenda he ranked, the voicemails he drafted, the covenant he'd stopped reading 18 months before. Defensive aggression feels like strength while you're doing it. It feels like taking control back, but it doesn't shield you. It documents you. He hadn't been beaten across that table. He'd been transcribed patiently, in his own words, over the better part of a week, and then read aloud. The board members who raised their hands were not doing it for me. I want that understood too. They were angry for their own reasons, their names on minutes next to his, their credibility downstream of his, the reporters they now had to answer for. I was the occasion, not the cause. A man's own board does not remove him because a stranger across the city wishes it. It removes him because he has made it impossible for them to stay in the room with him and still call themselves serious. That Edward did entirely without my help. Somewhere in the building, a clerk began preparing the notice. The same business channel that had carried the acquisition 2 mornings before was told there would be a second item. Same anchor, same morning slot. For the first time in his life, Edward Collins was about to be on television without having asked to be. I heard about it the way I hear about most things now, quietly, on a Thursday, while I was reading something else. I was at my desk with the Meridian term sheet, the next thing, the thing after the thing, the one Peter had already started flagging in the margins before I'd finished the first read. The office was doing its ordinary hum. Nothing about the morning felt like the morning a man's world ended, because for us, it wasn't. It was a Thursday with a term sheet on it. Peter came in with a coffee I hadn't asked for and set it on the corner of the desk. My phone lit with a notification. One line, just the company name and a single word after it that meant the vote had carried and the board had turned and the last public piece of it was done. Peter's hand was in the middle of setting the coffee down when the phone lit. His hand did not pause. The cup met the desk without a sound, square to the edge, the way Peter sets everything down, and he straightened and picked up the file he'd come in for. I looked at the phone. I turned it face down on the desk, the way I turned it face down at a kitchen table 2 nights before a woman decided I was finished. Then I picked the term sheet back up and found the line I'd been on. Peter's hand was perfectly steady. 11 years, and I have never once seen it do anything else. The world had just finished ending for 2 people across the city, and here the largest sound in the room was a coffee cup meeting a desk, and neither of us looked up, because there was a next page, and there is always a next page. On a screen somewhere behind an anchor's shoulder, my fund's name was going up again. I didn't need to watch it. I'd read the important version hours ago, in a room nobody was performing in, which is the only version that was ever really mine. People will tell you the sweet part of a thing like this is the moment the other man falls. It isn't. I've been near enough falls now to know that watching one is mostly just noise. Cameras, clerks, a chyron, an anchor reaching for the second most dramatic word she's allowed to use before 9. The quiet part is better. The quiet part is a steady hand setting down a coffee, and a term sheet open to the next page, and the small, unglamorous fact that whatever Edward had lost that morning, I hadn't gained the thing I didn't already hold the day before he ever poured a competitor's champagne. Nothing changed on my side of the city. That was always the point. The machine simply finished arriving, on the schedule it had kept for 14 months, and I happened to be the one still holding the far end of it when it did. "What's the timeline on Meridian?" I said. "End of the month," Peter said, already at the door. "Good." I turned the page. Part 9. The second broadcast aired the next morning, on the same channel, in the same slot, read by the same anchor who had said my name 2 days before. Edward watched it from his own living room. I wasn't there, and I didn't see it, and I've never once wished I had. But I know the shape of that room by now, and I know how it went. The anchor led with a board change at Corvin Holding Group, governance concerns, a director removed following the acquisition. She said Edward's name the way anchors say a name that has stopped being an asset and become a story, evenly, with the small professional care of a person handling something that has just cooled. Below her, in the lower third, my fund's name sat quietly under the words, acquiring party, the same 3 words from the resolution, following him from the paper onto the screen. Edward stood near the television. He did not sit. He couldn't bring himself to lower onto the same couch as Clara, and he couldn't make himself leave the room either, so he did the only thing left to a man in that position, which is to stand near the source of the bad news, as though proximity were a kind of control. He bought himself be removed on the channel he had spent a career being flattered by. For years that anchor's coverage had been oxygen to him, a mention, a favorable segment, his name in the right font. Now the same font carried him out. There is a particular cruelty in the symmetry of it, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't notice it later when the clips went around. Same channel, same anchor, same morning block, the one Peter had chosen weeks before any of this, for reasons that had nothing to do with Edward and everything to do with when the market pays attention. Edward had spent 30 years making that channel a mirror that flattered him. He had done favors to be on it. He had timed announcements for it. And now the mirror simply kept doing its job, reflecting whatever was placed in front of it. And what was placed in front of it that morning was his removal. No one turned the mirror against him. He had just never considered what it would show if he ever stood in front of it on the wrong day. His phone lay face down on the table. On it were 2 voicemails, drafted and dignified and mutually beneficial, sent to a number that had never registered them as received. He did not pick the phone up. There was no one left to call who would change the sentence on the screen, and some part of Edward Collins, the part that had always known, before anyone else in the room, exactly when a thing was over, had finally stopped reaching for the phone. Clara sat on the couch behind him. She watched the same broadcast, the same anchor, the same lower third, the same name that had been on her father's company and was now simply on everything. They were both in the room. They were both looking at the same screen. And they were not, in any way that counted, in the same place at all. 2 people who had chosen each other as the safe option, sitting a cushion apart, watching the proof that neither of them had been safe, and that neither had anything left to offer the other but company in the wreckage. Edward did not look at her. Not once. Not in anger. He'd have needed to spare something for anger, and he had nothing spare. He simply could not turn his head toward the person who was supposed to have made this morning easier and had isn't become one more thing in the apartment he could not fix. And here is the thing about the 2 of them in that room, the thing I think about when I think about it at all. 3 nights before, each of them had made the identical move. She had looked at a man who'd suddenly become a liability and removed him, cleanly, within hours. Edward had looked at a family whose usefulness was ending and would have done exactly the same the moment the numbers turned, had, in his way, been doing it for years, at 8% and a seat at the table. They were the same kind of animal, the two of them, and they had chosen each other precisely because each recognized the other's ruthlessness and mistook it for safety. What neither had understood is that you cannot build shelter out of two people whose defining talent is walking away from a sinking thing. Put two such people on the same couch and hand them a shared disaster, and all you get is two people calculating, in silence, how quickly they can be gone. Neither of them said a word. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been a negotiation, and they both, at last, had run out of leverage to negotiate with, even against each other. When the segment ended, he stayed standing a moment longer, then walked out of the room without a word, into some other part of the apartment, and left her there with the television and the settling quiet. Clara sat for a while. Then she got up because sitting had become unbearable, and she went to the kitchen for something to do with her hands. That was when she noticed the counter. The key was gone. Ethan's brass key on the little blue tab, the one she'd carried across the city 2 nights ago and set down here with such precision, choosing the exact spot, it was not on the counter anymore. She didn't know where it had gone. Edward might have moved it. He might have swept it into a drawer without a glance, the way you clear a stranger's clutter. It might have been anywhere. She did not ask. She stood at the counter and looked at the clean, empty stone where she'd placed it, and she did not ask anyone where it had gone, because the question had an answer she already understood, and it had nothing to do with the key. She stayed in the kitchen after Edward left. There was nothing to do in it. It was a kitchen no one cooked in, but it was somewhere to be that wasn't the couch, and she had reached the point in a bad day where you organize yourself by which room you can currently bear. She looked at the bare counter a while longer. Then she took out her phone. She opened the screenshot she'd taken 2 days ago, the message she'd written to Ethan and could never send, the one that started with, "I don't know if you ever," and stopped there, a sentence she still had no ending for. She read it once. She did not delete it. She had had 2 days to delete it and hadn't, and she wouldn't today either, and some part of her already knew she'd carry that little photograph of unsent words for a long time, the way you keep a receipt for a thing you can't return and can't quite throw away. She closed the screenshot. She set the phone face down on the table. Her jacket hung over the back of a chair, the same jacket she'd arrived in 3 nights ago. Inside the breast pocket was the folded page she'd printed on Edward's machine, the letter with no address, still there, still folded in careful thirds over the place where a heart is meant to be. She did not take it out. She knew exactly what it said. She had written it. Her bag sat by the chair. She opened it, looking for nothing, and there, soft at the creases, cream cardstock, the boring gala she'd complained about the whole ride home, was the program. His name still on the back page where it had always been, under the largest print, where she had never once looked until it was far too late to matter. She did not take it out either. She closed the bag. Then she sat at a kitchen table that was not hers, in an apartment that was not hers, in a life she had chosen at full speed, with complete information, in under 4 hours, and felt it finish closing around her. She had wanted the safe option. She had performed grief for 40 seconds, priced a man out at 11:47, and walked toward the open door and the cold champagne, doing, she thought, the clear-eyed, realistic thing. And the realistic thing had turned out to be a door into a smaller room, and then a smaller one, and now this, a chair in a kitchen where the man down the hall wouldn't look at her and the man across the city wouldn't call. She thought, sitting there, about the word she'd used more than any other in the last year of her life. Realistic. She'd said it to Ethan at the kitchen table, gently, like a diagnosis, that she was only ever trying to be realistic. She had built an entire self out of it, the woman clear-eyed enough to see which way a situation was tipping and to step off before it landed on her. And she had been right about everything except the one measurement that mattered. She'd read the man in the cheap blazer as the small number and the man with the open door as the large one, and she had been so certain, so realistic, so fast. Being wrong she could have survived. It was the speed of it that she'd have to live with, that she hadn't wavered, hadn't wondered, hadn't given the quiet man even the 4 hours of doubt he'd have been owed by someone who actually loved him. She had been realistic in exactly 4 hours, and the market had corrected in 6, and now she had the rest of her life to sit with a 13-minute gap between the two. Because that was the last true thing, and she understood it fully now, sitting there with the phone face down, and the letter in the jacket, and the program in the bag. Ethan had not called. Ethan was not going to call. Not out of cruelty, she'd have almost welcomed cruelty. Cruelty at least keeps you in someone's thoughts. He simply wasn't thinking of her at all. She had made herself, cleanly and permanently, into a person he no longer had any reason to think about, and there is no message you can leave with a warm assistant that undoes that. He had closed the account the same night she had. He'd just been the only one of them who understood what the account was worth. Somewhere in the other room the television was still on, my fund's name still riding the bottom of the screen, the name on the building now. She did not get up to turn it off. She just sat, in the quiet, with the objects, and let the position she'd chosen be the thing that it was. Across the city, I was at my desk. The Meridian term sheet was in front of me, marked up in Peter's small flags, the next thing already becoming the current thing the way it always does. Outside the glass the floor hummed along, a Thursday like any other, no one in the room treating the morning as the end of anything, because on our side of the city it wasn't. Nothing had changed here. That was the part I could never make anyone believe, and stopped trying to. I did not win anything that week. I already held it. The world simply found out. I was not on the second broadcast. I hadn't been on the first, not really. A hand, a pen, 30 seconds, then out past the cameras. I wasn't in the boardroom. I wasn't in the apartment. I was where I have always been, in a plain office with no name big enough to matter on the door, reading the next page, which is the only place any of it was ever actually decided. People want the ending to be the fall. They want the reaction shot, the ex with the phone, the rival with his hand flat on a table, the anchor saying the name. And those things happened, and they were, I'm told, satisfying to the people who needed them to be. But they were never the story. They were just the noise the story made on its way past. The story, if it was ever about anything, was about a man who had always been underestimated and had learned, a long time ago, to stop correcting it, because the correcting was where other men lost. You don't announce the building you own. You just answer the door in cheap shoes and let people tell you who you are. And when the paperwork finally introduces you, you're already 3 deals down the road, reading. People kept wanting me to feel vindicated afterward. Friends who knew a little of it would lean in and ask if it had felt good, the broadcast, the block that met a sealed line, the boardroom. And I never had the answer they wanted, because there was nothing to be vindicated of. I hadn't been diminished. That's the piece everyone gets backward. My dignity was never on the table that week. Only Clara's picture of me was, and a picture is not a thing a man has to win back. Peter knew who I was. My partners knew. The people who mattered had been treating me like the number on the page for 11 years, in a plain office on ordinary Thursdays. All that changed was that the rest of the world got a look. The man Clara thought she was leaving had never existed. The man who was actually there had simply gone on being there at his desk the whole time, unbothered, because he had nothing to prove to a room he'd already left. That is the only revenge worth anything, if you want to call it that, and it isn't revenge at all. It's just declining to become smaller because someone decided you were. You keep your voice level, you keep your hands clean, you go back to the work, and the people who mistook your quiet for weakness are left to explain, mostly to themselves, how they managed to walk out on the one door in the building that was load-bearing. Peter came in and set a coffee on the corner of my desk that I hadn't asked for. He didn't say anything. 11 years and the coffee arrives when it arrives, correct and unrequested, and he'll do it again tomorrow, and that is the most loyal thing I know. I looked up from the term sheet.